Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Chris Malloy, and I'm the Chancellor of Rutgers University, New Brunswick, and also a proud alumnus. As a colonial college, the history of Rutgers mirrors the evolution of America. And like America, we have often celebrated our diversity efforts without acknowledging our history of exclusion and inequity. Our ongoing journey of reconciliation, which started in 2015 with the Scarlet and Black Project, led by Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of History Deborah Gray White, ignited our commitment to seek out the untold story of disadvantaged population in the university's history. Volume 2 of Scarlet and Black examined how concepts related to race and gender evolved during the 20th century at Rutgers College and its newly created women's college, Douglass. It is fitting that this lecture series that seeks to examine Black activism and oppression throughout this nation's history is being hosted by Douglass Residential College. This women's college, a symbol of equal rights for one social identity, also disadvantaged and denied access to another, Black women. It is because of this complicated history that we are here tonight and why conversations like these are so important. We cannot move forward until we fully acknowledge and learn from our past. In this current moment of racial reckoning, an openness to understanding our shared history is the only way to recognize the harm caused, to make amends, and do better. I am committed to doing better, and your presence here tonight is reflective of your shared commitment as well. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Jackie Litt, Dean of Douglass, and I welcome you for tonight's lecture in our ongoing series, Dean Series, Critical Conversations on Black History. We designed the Dean Series to bring our Douglass and Rutgers communities together to dialogue about issues of systemic racial injustice throughout our nation's history. This year, students, alumni, faculty, and friends have gathered to learn from leading historians working to publicly unravel the historical creations and recreations through human action of foundational racism, which continues to plague us today, despite tremendous activism and advocacy toward its end. Thus far, the series has hosted two alumni who really engaged in what was happening currently, and one is Dana Grant, a human resources leader for the County of Essex, and another is Dr. Deborah Joy Perez, who is a senior philanthropic advisor and has had a leading role in creating equity in philanthropy through foundational work. We turned then to leading historians, and we started with somebody we all know, Dr. Jonathan Holloway, historian, author, and president of Rutgers University, who spoke from his new book, The Cause of Freedom, A Concise History of African Americans. Dr. Keisha Blaine came later, author and his associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, who spoke from her book, Set the World on Fire, Black Nationalist Women and the Global Struggle for Freedom. In April, we will have the opportunity to meet Isabel Wilkerson, author of, most recently of the book Cast, as the Rawley Chair in Women's Studies, IWL, and Douglas. Tonight, the amazing Dr. Barbara Ransby is here, who will be introduced in a moment by the president of Rutgers, Jonathan Holloway. I couldn't help but resist in this introduction to fail to quote President Holloway's part of his op-ed in the New York Times a few weeks ago. And I think it really does set us up beautifully for what we'll hear tonight and what the series really attempts to capture. So he writes, quote, "Black history is profoundly illuminating. It produces a bright light by which we can make an honest assessment of how well our actions align with the ideals that have led us to proclaim that ours is a special nation. Black History Month is a time that dares us to think about the limitations of the Proud Boys white nationalism that excludes the diversity that is one of this country's strengths. Each of our speakers throughout the series has brought valuable expertise and engaging dialogue to our community, challenging us to engage even deeper with the reality of the dangerous white supremacist ideology and systems at play in our world, and the understanding of how we as a Rutgers community can intervene. So at this point, I would like to turn to introduce President Jonathan Holloway, who will introduce Dr. Ransby. Jonathan Holloway, the 21st president of Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, is an eminent historian and an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Science. He began his transformative presidency on July 1st, 2020. He previously served as provost of Northwestern University and dean of Yale College. And as I said, he has a brand new book out. I don't know how he managed to do that in the last year, but it's really quite something. The Cause of Freedom, A Concise History of African Americans, published by Oxford University Press. This is one book among many produced by Dr. Holloway. So at this point, President Holloway, I will ask you to introduce Dr. Ransby.
Thank you so much, Dean Litt, for that, helping the audience understand the journey that Douglas is on, and thank you as well for your kind words and for referencing that op-ed. I think it's, I hope that it's a contributing factor into a larger conversation about the role of African-American history. Tonight is definitely a moment that is contributing to that history. I'm so excited and honored to be introducing tonight's speaker, eminent historian, award-winning author, lifelong activist, and least important of these to her, but certainly not to me, my friend, Dr. Barbara Ransby. Her first book, Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement, A Radical Democratic Vision, is a really amazing piece of history. The book gave Ella Baker, a longtime activist, the recognition she deserved, and it rightly earned all kinds of national book awards. It's an extraordinary book that I highly recommend. I recall when it came out leading graduate seminars, this book was required reading in just about every graduate seminar I knew about. Dr. Ransby followed that up with another important and award-winning book, Eslanda, The Large and Unconventional Life of Mrs. Paul Robeson. Of course, Rutgers has taken great pride in claiming Paul Robeson as one of our most accomplished and consequential alumni. But Dr. Ransby's book pulls Essie Robeson out of her husband's shadow and reveals her own remarkable and important contributions. Professor Ransby's most recent book, published in 2018, is titled Making All Black Lives Matter, Reimagining Freedom in the 21st Century, and has only gained in relevance over the past year in light of what has become the largest social movement in our lifetimes. Professor Ransby also contributes to several journals, including serving as editor-in-chief of Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society. Dr. Ransby holds the John D. MacArthur Chair at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she has appointments in the departments of Black Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, and History. At the university, she directs the Social Justice Initiative, which connects its faculty with community organizers working on social justice issues. Social justice has been a theme throughout Professor Ransby's life. To give a few examples, she took an active part in the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. She founded the Ella Baker Nelson Mandela Center for Anti-Racist Education. She co-founded the organization African American Women in Defense of Ourselves, which is a forerunner of the movement for Black Lives. She is a founding member of the national organization Scholars for Social Justice. Dr. Ransby has been named among the top 25 women in higher education by the publication Diverse Issues in Higher Education, and earned the Angela Y. Davis Prize from the American Studies Association for scholarship in service of the public good. To the Douglas community, you are in for a treat. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Barbara Ransby.
Well, thank you so much. I want to first thank Dean Jackie Litt and her staff at Douglas Residential College at Rutgers, New Brunswick, for inviting me to be with you this evening. And of course, thank you so much to my friend, President Jonathan Holloway, for that generous and lovely introduction. And I do consider your friendship as actually an important aspect of my bio. I really feel like I'm a part of the Rutgers family now. I mean, President Holloway and I were just at another program the other day hosted by Rutgers Newark with my good friend Nancy Cantor and Jack Chen, and here we are again tonight. So I guess you all will just have to adopt me. I'm excited about tonight's conversation because I want to offer some reasons for optimism in these very difficult and challenging times. And I want to do so by looking at history and looking at the future. And I should say parenthetically, those of you who don't know me, I come to you as a scholar and an activist, as my introduction suggests. I very much am a part of the movements that I now write about. And I really offer my scholarship in service to movements. So in my remarks today, I want to lift up the importance of dreamers and doers. Dreamers in urgent times. Now that might initially sound kind of oxymoronic, right? Because when we think of moments of urgency, moments of crisis, we don't necessarily think of dreamers. We think of the need to engage in concrete interventions, decisive actions, but we don't necessarily think that dreams are a part of that toolkit. But what I want to suggest is that indeed there is no contradiction. That people, from scientists to educators to organizers who have made the most transformative change in our society have been people who, put their shoulders to the wheel, but also people who engaged in very, very robust dreaming. Of course, we think of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and one of his most powerful speeches. He coined the term the fierce urgency of now. And of course, he was a quintessential dreamer and doer. He could not have been more prescient in talking about this historical moment, which is one of both peril and possibility. So yes, we do live in urgent times. We have a growing white nationalist movement that culminated in a violent attempted coup on January 6th. We have lost nearly 500,000 Americans to a deadly global pandemic, many of whom could have been and should have been saved. We've seen the largest protest movement, and President Holloway alluded to this, the largest protest movement against racism in US history. New York Times estimated that up to 26 million people participated in protests in the streets between May and September of last year after the vicious murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And we have just lived through a presidency like no other. We are, in essence, a nation divided on a planet at risk. So in response to this moment, we need concrete actions. We need decisive interventions, but we also need dreamers. Let me pause here to offer a short poem by the great and eloquent Langston Hughes, and it's one of my favorites. Langston Hughes wrote, "We must hold on to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly." This is true of individual lives, but it is also true of movements for change. If you look at history, you see those movements that soared and succeeded, that had the greatest and most far-reaching impact, were movements that were populated by dreamers. In order to make change, in order to make real transformative change, we have to believe in the power of new possibilities. We have to be able to look out at what is in front of us and imagine what it can become. One of the things about being a historian is that we see change unfold over time. In fact, that's really the definition of the field of history, is the study of change over time. And often we go back and we try to get into the heads and the thoughts and the hearts of historical actors. We read their letters and speeches and treatises written from a different time and a different place. And knowing more about their stories and how their stories end than they could have possibly known at the time. So for example, when we read about the anti-apartheid movement, and again, as President Holloway indicated, I was very involved in that movement, it was very close to my heart. When we think about that movement at its peak in the 1970s and 80s, including the Solidarity movement, I can tell you that tens of thousands of people all over the world, many of them young people, marched and rallied and lobbied and got arrested and got bailed out and got rearrested, screaming to the governments of the world, screaming to the corporate leaders of the world that the racist system of apartheid that effectively disenfranchised the majority of the Black population could not stand and would not stand. People on the front lines in South Africa fought and died in that struggle. And they did not know then that they would win. Their actions, their sacrifices were made in the hope and the expectation of some margin of victory, but they did not know that they would win. They took a risk, they took a leap of faith, they invested their dreams for a better future. And they did win. The situation in South Africa certainly is not perfect, and many of us were disappointed that the victory was not larger, but it was a game-changing victory that changed the political terrain of the continent and the world. But those activists, humble, imperfect, flawed, sometimes confused, sometimes divided, looked out at the dark, grim realities of 1961 and 1976 and 1984, all pivotal turning points in that movement's history. And they imagined something different. And they imagined themselves as agents of change who could make that difference. That is important. We can go back even further in time and think of the antebellum period in this country's history. That period between 1619 and 1865, when the overwhelming majority of people of African descent were enslaved people, were property of non-Black people. Enslaved people who were forced to work for free, who could be beaten at the whim of their so-called masters, who could be sold to other slaveholders and separated from their families forever. Can we imagine getting into the heads and hearts of those enslaved people? Can we imagine how it must have felt to be defined as property, as the property of another man or woman? And to look out every day at a seemingly all-powerful system, a seemingly unchecked power system of the slaveholding class. Slaveholders had the ability to met out violence with regularity and impunity. We can only imagine what our ancestors must have felt living inside such a terror-filled system. Could they have imagined those millions of enslaved souls a day when the entire system would crumble? Well, some did. Some had the visionary strength and the moral courage to take that leap of faith. Harriet Tubman did, Sojourner Truth did, Frederick Douglass did, John Brown did. They were dreamers, believers, freedom fighters, justice seekers, and ultimately history makers. It's important that we remember that at the time, many of them were unpopular. Many of them paid great prices for their commitments. Some people called them crazy. Many people stood in their way. And Frederick Douglass, we revere him now, but Frederick Douglass literally had to fight his way out of meeting halls when he went on speaking tours to talk about the abolition of slavery. And David Blight, the great historian, reminds us of this in his fine biography of Frederick Douglass. So in other words, dreamers were not sitting on the sidelines. Dreamers were not watching the clouds go by. Dreamers were engaged in the battle to determine the future of history. Even in the period of the civil rights movement, that is the mid-20th century Black freedom movement, a more recent time, there were those who believed the system of Jim Crow segregation would last forever. In fact, one of the mantras of the pro-segregationist movement was segregation now and segregation forever. And for those of you too young to remember, this is not distant past. You probably have parents or grandparents, those of you who are students, who remember this period. A period that not so long ago, more than half of this country lived under a rule of Jim Crow segregation, which was in essence, racial subordination. There were whites-only water fountains and parks, whites-only schools and hospitals and cemeteries. So from birth to grave, segregation was enforced as a part of a racial regime of white supremacy. Now, when we think of that period, it is hard to imagine the everyday, the way in which such injustices can be normalized. You may be wondering at this point, when does the optimism part come in? But the point of these stories from history is to say that they changed, and they changed because people like us, people who might have felt very ordinary on some level, did some very extraordinary things to create those pivots and those hinges on which history in fact turned. In the case of the mid-20th century Black freedom movement, a young woman named Claudette Colvin, an older woman named Rosa Parks, an even older woman named Ella Baker, the young people of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and a lot of anti-racist white people in organizations like the Southern Conference Education Fund, people like Ann Braden and others. Those people put bodies on the line to disrupt business as usual, to say no more, to say not on our watch. And like the young people of South Africa, they went up against some of the most powerful people in the country, people who blocked their actions, threatened to, and in fact did do them harm. They were not sure they would win, but they had vision, they had dreams, they had guts, and they had determination. If any of you have seen any of the documentaries about the Black freedom movement in the 20th century, you know that it was not an easy fight. Systems and institutions don't change easily. To quote Frederick Douglass, of course, power yields nothing without a demand. Desegregation sit-ins starting in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960 were met with all kinds of violent confrontation. Participants in those sit-ins had hot coffee poured on them, lit cigarettes gouged into their backs. They were mocked, maligned, and some were killed. But those that survived continued to fight. the Diane Nashes, the Kwame Tures, the John Lewises and Joyce Ladners, the Charlie Cobbs. These may not be names that you're very familiar with, but these were the great heroes and heroines of that period because they were on the right side of history and they acted on the belief that they were on the right side of history. Now, this brings me to the urgency of our own moment. And what I want to talk about here is one of the great social movements of our time. It is not a perfect movement. It's not a movement without contradictions or weaknesses, but it has made a lasting impact in our political and cultural landscape. And of course, I'm talking about what is commonly known as the Black Lives Matter movement, but in its organizational form today, it is centered around something called the Movement for Black Lives, which is a coalition of over 100 organizations that have been involved in the protests since the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012. I wrote a book about the Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter in 2018, and have been fortunate enough to spend a great deal of time with some of the leaders of the movement. And so I want to focus this evening on this as a visionary movement, very much in the spirit of other freedom fighters in African-American history. This movement, we know, has engaged in all kinds of creative, disruptive tactics to draw attention to the issue of racial violence. They have marched, they have picketed, they have shut down freeways, they have disrupted events. They have gone to great lengths to underscore the fact that racism cannot and should not be tolerated in this moment. And much of that has centered around the question of state violence or police violence, but it's not limited to that. I want to talk about three aspects of the visionary politics of the Movement for Black Lives. One is around leadership. It represents a firm break with the hierarchical male-centered leadership that dominated the 20th century Black political movements, and is deeply, deeply grounded in an unapologetically Black feminist politic. Secondly, I want to talk about the movement's disavowal of the politics of respectability. And I'll talk about what that means in just a moment. And finally, I want to focus on its far-reaching and robust and transformative demands. So let me say a little bit about leadership. When the Black Lives Matter protests erupted across the country in 2014 after the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, many observers said it was a leaderless movement. Why did they say that? Because many of those observers didn't see the kind of leadership they were looking for. They didn't recognize the Stokely Carmichaels or the Julian Bonds or the Al Sharptons or the Jesse Jacksons. But what Patrisse Cullors argues, Patrice Khan Cullors, who is one of the three founders of the hashtag Black Lives Matter, she said, we're not a leaderless movement. We're a leaderful movement. And when she said that, she was speaking very much in the tradition of Ella Baker. Ella Baker believed that grassroots leadership was critically important. She felt that liberation could only be achieved when people rejected a messianic savior type leader and relied on themselves and one another. And this movement has really embraced that ethos. It is also significant that many of the movement leaders that have emerged in organizations like the Dream Defenders, like Black Youth Project 100, like Freedom Inc. in Wisconsin, like Southerners on New Ground, the leaders are overwhelmingly Black, young, queer women. Many of them define themselves as feminists. In fact, all of the three co-founders of the hashtag Black Lives Matter identify as feminists, and they embody an intersectional Black feminist politic. I want to shift now to just say something about this question of the politics of respectability. And that's a term that non-academics and non-historians may not be wholly familiar with. And I just want to define it by quoting my colleague, Fred Harris, who wrote in Salon magazine this wonderful essay that talked about respectability politics. And he says, as politics, respectability has long shaped negotiations across the color line. In exchange for a promise to morally police the behavior of poor and working class Black populations. Potential white allies validate the leadership of middle class and elite African Americans. It also marginalizes those who are not willing to check their anger, and those who don't or refuse to use proper language to express that anger. In effect, the politics of respectability accepts the exclusion of those deemed unrespectable from the protections of first-class citizenship. So we can think of the example of Rosa Parks in the 1950s, who was, of course, the iconic leader of the Montgomery bus boycott, sat down on the bus, people mobilized and rallied around her. One of the reasons she was selected is the way that she presented, which was a calm, respectable, proper, church-going Black woman. What this movement is saying is not that those qualities should be eschewed, but that those are not conditions for liberation or for rights. And in fact, it is the most marginalized sectors of our communities. Poor and working class Black folks, formerly incarcerated Black folks, queer and trans Black folks, disabled Black folks, who have to be at the center of our consciousness. That is what radical inclusivity means. And that is what this movement has embraced. Very much in the spirit of many Black feminist writers, from Bell Hooks to Beverly Guy Sheftall, and very much in the spirit of the Combahee River Collective, which of course was a foundational Black feminist document from the 1970s. Black feminism shows up in all kinds of ways in this movement. One way it shows up is by who is or is not a legitimate victim of police violence. Many of the most well-known victims, of course, have been Black men, but in the Say Her Name campaign, initiated by Kimberly Crenshaw and the Black Youth Project 100, introduced us to a whole list of women, a whole number of cases of women and femme victims of police violence whose names never made it to the front pages of newspapers, insisting that we are all vulnerable and insisting on a movement culture that includes everyone. And of course, most recently, added to the names of Sandra Bland and Rekia Boyd and others is the very prominent case of Breonna Taylor, a young woman killed by a reckless police raid on her home while sleeping in the night. The third aspect of the visionary leadership of this movement that I want to highlight is what the movement has demanded. Again, sometimes people are not listening carefully, and a slogan is really not a full-bodied demand. The movement has produced a number of documents, most recently the Breathe Act, which is a mock bill that talks about ways to move away from policing as we know it and towards security and safety and justice. But an earlier document was the Vision for Black Lives. And that document, like so many, embodied an abolitionist politic. And many people at the outset were like, are they out of their minds? What does it mean to think of a world without prisons, as Angela Davis argues? What does it mean to think of defunding the police? There will be chaos in the streets. And of course, this notion that these are unrealistic, impractical, unrealizable demands is only evidence of the narrowness of our imagination, because with all the historical examples that I've given you, in all those moments and all those examples, people looked at the immediacy of their situation. They looked at the reality right outside their door. And many people thought, this is the way it will always be. And they were wrong. The dreamers, the organizers, the people who took up the task of transforming and making history created a reality that many thought was impossible. And that is what is happening today. That in this moment of a proto-fascist threat, we also see some of the most creative, ambitious organizing that we have seen in generations. When Black Lives Matter wrote one of its early documents, and this is an example of the large and ambitious goals that the movement has embraced. One of the documents reads in this way: when our political activism isn't rooted in a theory about transforming the world, it becomes narrow. When it is focused only on individual actors instead of the larger systemic problems, it becomes short-sighted. We do have to deal with the current crisis in the short term. That is indeed important. We have to have solutions for people's real life problems, and we have to allow people to decide what those solutions are. But we also have to create a vision that's much bigger than what we have now. And I will add, a Nation essay by Michael Denzel Smith, in which he talks about being asked by interviewers, are you serious about abolishing prisons and police? And what would you replace them with? And his answer was, when I say abolish the police, I mean replace them with full social, economic, and political equality. Now, what does that mean? That speaks to how he analyzes the cause or the underlying causes of much of the behavior that leads to the behavior that we term criminal, much of it crimes against property. So these are ambitious demands. Some would say radical demands, transformative demands, forward-looking demands. They're the kind of demands that the Me Too movement has made: zero tolerance for sexual violence. Who would have thought that some of the most well-connected and wealthy sexual predators in this country would have been rendered powerless by a movement of women that they sought to intimidate into silence? Who would have thought that a bunch of young people, loud and determined and creative and theatrical, would be able to move a climate change agenda in countries around the world? Organizations like the Sunrise Movement and many others. These are movements in motion, movements that are making an impact in our world as we speak. And they are populated, again, by doers and dreamers. When we think of some of those expansive documents, we have to think, who are the Movement for Black Lives organizers really seeking to liberate? Obviously, it is a movement of Black people centered on the issue of anti-Black racism. But as many of the leaders and spokespersons and organizers for this movement will tell you, the promise of liberating all Black people is really a universal agenda for freedom. Because if we talk about liberating all Black people, we have to talk about disabled Black people and queer Black people and poor Black people and disenfranchised Black people and incarcerated Black people. So we're talking about then challenging and questioning and undoing and unraveling the oppressive systems that ensnare them. And they're not there by themselves. Another example of history, when you think of the period of Reconstruction, the creation of a public school system in the South was in response to Black freed people who were defining a part of their freedom as a right to education. But many poor, uneducated white children in rural parts of the South benefited from that public education system. So it is not a zero-sum game. Now, I want to just ask all of you to think of, what does this have to do with you? I'm not looking at the crowd. I wish we were all in a room together and we could interact in a more personal way. But I'm assuming that many of you are not Black students or Black faculty or Black alums. You may be Latinx, you may be Asian American, you may be Arab American, you may be white. You may identify in a whole number of ways. But what I would say is that we have to see ourselves, we have to write ourselves into movements for justice, no matter who we are. We have to enter those movements with humility. And we have to decide what side of history we want to stand on. I'm so encouraged and inspired when I read the words of James Baldwin, and I think he captures what this moment and this movement is about. When in his book, The Fire Next Time, he urges readers to demand the impossible. He says, I know what I'm asking is impossible, but in our own time, in every time, the impossible is the least one can demand. He's asking for that large, capacious imagination. And I would say that too, especially to you, those of you who are students, you're in your teens or early 20s, you have dreams of what will happen next in the society and in your own lives. So I encourage you to dream of the impossible and make it possible. Forget about those small dreams like a car and a good job. Those things are important, but dream of changing the world and situate yourself in that long and rich and wonderful tradition of freedom making, which demands you to be a doer, a thinker, and an active dreamer. We're counting on you. I think I'll stop my remarks there and we can shift to our question and answers.
Thank you, Dr. Ransby. That was really beautiful and inspiring. So I'm very grateful that you'll take some time to respond to questions. We have a mix of alumni and Rutgers and Douglas staff, faculty, and students in our audience. So let's.
I encourage them not to be shy.
Yep, I'm with you. Okay, so I'm going to try to find, I can't seem to open the Q&A. Let's see if I can open the chat. Karina, can you get the Q&A open?
I have it open.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. If you can go ahead.
The first question is, do you think all issues should be addressed in terms of intersectionality so we can be unified and go to the root of our issues? Well, short answer and long answer. Short answer is yes. If I didn't use the term intersectionality, I use it in almost every speech that I give. Sometimes intersectionality for folks who haven't been introduced to feminism and women of color feminism and Black feminism in the academy sounds like a cumbersome word. But intersectionality is really a longstanding tradition that existed before there was a name for it. And it really means no one gets thrown under the bus and no one gets left behind. And that we embrace the large, perhaps daunting challenge of liberation on all fronts, right? That we understand the interconnectedness of patriarchy and misogyny to racism and white supremacy, and I would add to racial capitalism, and that we have to talk about dismantling those structures as a part of one overall project. That's why, single issue organizing is the entry point that many people find to come into movements, but increasingly, coalitions and networks and multi-issue formations are the most impactful. And so yes to that question about intersectionality, however we label it, that is the approach that will get us as far as we can possibly go, down the road to a more just society. Let's see.
I'm sorry, Dr. Ransby.
You locked out?
I am locked out of the Q&A. Would you rather someone from Douglas take over?
No.
Okay, all right. Thank you
for fine. I just don't, I can entertain a question from you as well so that you're included. But the next question is about something that you kind of told me that many of the students are interested in, and which is the question of allyship. It says, would you please address allyship? So, I have a kind of layered set of feelings about allyship. We are desperately searching for a better term. Some people use the term collaborators or co-conspirators or co-liberationists, because allyship sometimes suggests as a term that people who aren't directly affected or most acutely affected by a particular form of oppression or discrimination are simply coming to the aid of others. And I would argue that all of us are implicated in one way or another. All of us are compromised in one way or another. But when we are not bearing the brunt of that particular aspect of oppression, then we have to come into the work with open ears, open hearts, and a lot of humility. But it doesn't mean that we stand on the sidelines. Come in, I mean, learn about it. I mean, listen to various perspectives on how you address it. Because if you say I'm an ally of Black struggle, well, what if all Black people don't agree? Which, by the way, is the case. You have to then have an opinion. Where do you ally yourself? Where do you weigh in? Where do you contribute? Similar with solidarity movements. The anti-apartheid movement has been referenced a lot tonight. There were sectors of that struggle in South Africa that were not in sync with one another. And so movements here had to know enough about the politics and the history to decide, who to ally with. So I don't want allyship to ever be an excuse for us to abdicate owning our values and our principles, learning about the details of struggles in communities that we are not a part of. But yes, stand up, step up, speak out. This is not, freedom is not a spectator process. So, and that your own investment in the future and your role as a history maker is determined by what you do and don't do, what you say and don't say. And so, yes, allyship, co-liberationists, we all have a stake in this. And so we all have to find our place and honor the place of others who have, fought before we entered and who are suffering in ways that we may not be. Okay. Can you recommend 2 of your favorite books to inspire deep thinking on social movements? Oh my goodness. Well, there are so many. Of course, you should read President Holloway's most recent book. I would be remiss not to say that. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has written a number of books. I'm serious, Jonathan. That was honest. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has written a number of books, a recent book on housing and the history of discrimination in housing, which is really important and talks also about activism. Naomi Klein's writings about climate change and organizing as a result of, in response to climate. I would recommend all of those. Mark Lamont Hill. Yeah, there are too many to I love the question. I should have been more prepared with a short list for you. But yeah, I think you have a good start with that. Someone asks, these are lovely questions. Do you feel overwhelmed by the task ahead? Some days. I mean, I feel overwhelmed and excited. I'm starting a new project at the university where I am. I run the social justice initiative, and we're starting something called the Portal Project. And it's inspired by a quote from Arundhati Roy, the wonderful Indian writer, who talks about pandemics as portals. It is sort of the flip side of the notion of disaster capitalism, which Naomi Klein writes about, in which she talks about the ways in which elites use crises to further agendas and policies that they wouldn't be able to advance in normal times. Well, Arundhati Roy's notion of pandemic as portal suggests that in moments of crisis and dislocation, when we're kind of living in this suspended animation and an intense sense of urgency, is also the moment when people are open to new ideas and open to change in ways that perhaps they would not be otherwise. And I know, just personally, all of our lives have changed. We start to think about fundamental questions of work and relationships and sociality. And so I'm overwhelmed in a sense at times. I would not be honest to say that I'm not, because there's so much work to do, but I'm also energized and hopeful and excited. And thank you for that question.
Dr. Ransby, this is Jackie.
Yes.
I wonder if I can ask you to talk further about that. in my own research on Hurricane Katrina, so really, I think I'm asking you why you think the exposure of the disregard for Black and brown lives in the pandemic will continue to resonate. What I saw in Katrina, there was a short window where there was public outrage and support for the mostly Black survivors of that disaster, but that dissipated very quickly. And I wonder what is in our historical context now that gives you hope?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the agency of people who are experiencing the violence and the racism, not simply the spectacle of suffering or the sympathy of others. But I mean,
Okay.
we saw protests around Katrina, but we didn't see the kind of movement that we saw in response to George Floyd's murder. And that movement involved many, many people, involved a lot of non-Black people, but it was inspired, it was called, it was shaped and framed by the Black freedom movement of the 21st century. So I see the organizing that these organizations and young people are doing. I see the strategizing that they're doing. I see the relationships that they're building. And so it's that work that is often not evident at the fore that I'm placing my confidence in. Rashad Robinson, who heads The Color of Change, said something in an interview recently, and I have a lot of respect for him. He said, anti-racism is becoming a majoritarian issue.
Good.
That doesn't mean that everybody that says they're opposed to racism really even understands it, but it means that the political pulse is shifting. And I think that's true. And what we do with that is really important. So yeah, I mean, people have been outraged by various, spectacles of racism and devaluation of Black life. But what we see is the cumulative impact of movements that have tapped into that outrage, have confronted sometimes the limited actions that were associated with that outrage, and are pushing in very smart and strategic and determined ways for concrete changes. So that's the source of my optimism.
Thank you. That really helps clarify my thinking too. That's really beautiful. So do you have the questions? I have a couple in chat.
I do. They're coming at different angles.
I know.
Let's see. Okay. So Kathy asked the question, how do you see the relationship between Movement for Black Lives, producing the Breathe Act, and what comes next in terms of the nitty-gritty of getting this bill passed? Great question. So the Breathe Act was designed actually by a group of movement lawyers in the SE Justice Project in New York, and I think they're based in New York. Maybe it's Oakland. I'm interacting with people so much on Zoom, you never know where people are actually located. But the SE Justice Project, and it was designed as a kind of mock piece of legislation. But I'll tell you a tangible result here in Illinois. An organization called EAT, Equity and Transformation, which is a group that organizes folks in the informal economy. It's led by a young man named Rich Wallace, who works very closely with formerly incarcerated citizens. They took the Breathe Act, which was developed as national legislation, to allies in the Illinois legislature. And the Black Caucus of the Illinois legislature took large chunks of that omnibus bill and actually put it into one of the most sweeping criminal justice reform bills that we have seen in the state of Illinois, which includes the elimination of cash bail, which is a wonderful victory because cash bail is an utter disgrace. It is racially biased and certainly class biased. But that's just one small victory. Well, I should say small. I live in Illinois, so it's big for me. But one victory that has come out of that, and I will tell you, when I first saw the Breathe Act, I thought to myself, wonderful. Are we really going to move this? But now I'm seeing ways in which it's moving. It's not exactly moving in the way we might have predicted, but different networks of activists in states around the country and even in municipalities are taking parts of the bill and implementing it. I found it very interesting what's happening in Ithaca right now, where you have the youngest mayor and the first Black mayor, who is essentially disbanding the police force and creating a Department of Community Solutions and Public Safety, which really is a rethinking of policing in a fundamental way, and one of the things that the Breathe Act calls for. So we're seeing traction.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question. So Dr. Ransby, this is your call.
Let's see. So the next person in the queue here is, do you worry that women-led movements are leader-full because it is harder for individual women to be recognized as strong leaders? I have thought about that question. I thought about that question a lot when I did my work on Ella Baker, because here I was celebrating her, selfless, behind-the-scenes leadership. But what I came to realize is that there was enormous power and choice and agency in what she was doing. She wasn't behind the scenes quietly. She was behind the scenes, raising a ruckus, challenging male leaders, insisting on things, fighting the good fight. She just wasn't succumbing to what I think ultimately is a kind of masculinist form of leadership, which is very ego-driven, very individual-centered. She was rejecting that. At the same time, she was fighting against the sexism of many of her male colleagues. So it's a bit of a catch-22. I mean, one could say sometimes when I talk a lot about racial capitalism these days, and people say, well, talking about racial capitalism, why should Black people not be rich? So is liberation, is liberation and progress and justice a sort of cosmetic inclusivity within problematic and unjust hierarchies, or is it rethinking those hierarchies? And I really hope that it's the latter for all of us who really have, the goal of transformative justice. So, this is a debate right now with the Biden administration, which we all fought very hard to see a regime change in Washington. And I think this, it's definitely progress, but I am cautious about representational politics that simply show women or Black and brown faces in positions of power. I'm more interested in what they do when they're in those positions. And so that has been a lesson of this movement as well. They have criticized Black and Latinx police officers who collaborate with the violence and abuse of Black people and Black communities. They've criticized Black mayors and DAs who have participated in the project of mass targeted incarceration. So we have to look at what people do. We have to look at outcomes, politics, and principles, as well as the question of diversity, which can be very limited and actually can be a cover for some of the structural changes that really need to happen.
Well, that's a beautiful response to a beautiful and inspiring talk. And I want to thank you, Dr. Ransby, for your generosity of time and thought, and your sharing your thinking with Douglas College here. And I really sincerely hope that we see you again at Douglas.
I seem to be making the rounds at Rutgers, so
I know.
I'm happy to come back. But also thank you for the kind invitation, and your students should know the absolute care and attention to detail that you and your staff took. I mean, this was not a perfunctory event. You made sure I knew who I would be speaking to and what you're trying to accomplish at Douglas. So I appreciate that seriousness of purpose.
Thank you. And we can acknowledge here Karina Hernandez, who's our
Absolutely.
head of diversity, inclusion, and equity at Douglas.
Karina was
So
terrific.
yeah, she is terrific. So thank you again, and all the best to you.
Thank you so much, and good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.